Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church, and Pastor Danette Christofferson and I each week are trying to offer a brief introduction to two of our Bible readings according to the weekly lectionary. So this lesson is about Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35, which is the gospel reading for Sunday, September 13th, 2020. In this reading, we pick up where we left off last Sunday. Last Sunday, you had the three steps of reconciliation, and it was offered to remind Matthew's community and Jesus reminding his disciples that when relationships are ruptured, we really need to do all that we can do to restore broken relationships. We know it's complicated, we know it's hard. We also are given the promise that Jesus is with us whenever we're doing this kind of work. So in our reading for today, we pick up and we see the importance of forgiveness reiterated as Jesus offers a story to reinforce the centrality of forgiveness within the Christian community. It appears that Matthew includes this reading in his gospel because more than likely, as the church began to grow, as people came from different backgrounds, there were differences of opinions, viewpoints, and relationships were hurt and broken. So we see here that this is directed specifically within the Christian community. So verse 21, you hear, if another member of the church, though forgiveness has universal application, in this case, we need to think about our faith community. When a broken relationship happens, how do we do whatever we can do to try to restore, forgive, reconcile? Peter, again lifted up as the chief spokesperson of the group, asked Jesus a question, and this may be an attempt by Peter to try to show his teacher, his rabbi, that he actually is learning a few things, and he recognizes that Jesus is not going to just settle for the status quo or what normal practice is, because in Peter's day, in Jesus's day, a rabbi said that as a good Jew, you would need to forgive a person up to 3 times for an offense that they caused against you. So Peter, maybe trying to score brownie points or get a few more stars on his paper, says, how many times, Jesus, should I forgive a brother or sister who offends me, who sins against me? 7 times? That's a great number. That's a God number. That's a number for completion. And it's more than what is practiced and expected. But even by offering 7, it appears Peter wants to put a limit on forgiveness. So in verse 22, Jesus uses his teaching to help his students, his disciples, understand what the kingdom of heaven or the reign of God is like on earth as it is in heaven. He teaches that when it comes to the forgiveness of God, God is not and will not be limited. So Jesus' answer of 77 times or 7 times 70 is indicative of you need to forgive as often as is necessary to save a relationship, to restore a relationship, to keep the community whole. So what does it mean to forgive? Literally, the word used here means to send away, releasing, letting go of past behaviors holding power over your own emotions and intentions. You might know forgiveness has really happened when the name of a person who's wronged you or the retelling of particular offenses no longer raise your blood pressure or cause distress in your gut or creates thoughts of getting even. When you can talk about a person or an event and you don't have that psychological, physiological reaction that you actually are calm and at peace about it, it may be that you really have begun to let go of it. But note, forgiving is not forgetting. And forgiveness does not remove consequences of behavior. So we get to this story of the parable of the unforgiving servant. To illustrate to his disciples and for Matthew to teach his congregation, we read the story using a negative example to teach an important lesson. As often with Jesus' parable or stories, the use of hyperbole or strong exaggeration to make a point is evident. In this story, we see the dangers of keeping score or keeping count. Pastor Brian Stoffergen writes, there are a number of indications that in this particular story, the king is a Gentile. One, the huge sum of money, 10,000 talents. This could only be explained as being tax revenue from a very powerful king. It is much more than King Herod received each year from all the territories he was over. He received around 900 talents, so this is over 10 times that amount. Two, the king is worshiped by the slave, by his posturing of himself, laying before the king, begging him. This is something a Jewish person would not do because you're only able to worship one God, the God of Israel, Yahweh. Third, Jewish law prohibited the wife and family from being sold into slavery. And fourth, while Jewish law allowed a man to be imprisoned for debt, it did not allow him to be tortured. So just some little notes on the background of this potential story. And it may have been a scene that Matthew's congregation saw or Jesus's disciples experienced or saw lived out in some way. Verse 27 would be a surprise to both the audience of the disciples and Matthew's congregation. The way the world worked was transactional and retributive. When the king shows pity and forgives what would be an impossible amount to pay in a lifetime, that is not how the world operates. But it is how God operates. The slave is set free to return home and resume his servant duties, and his previous debt has been canceled. So think about this. What is your initial reaction to this generous act of forgiveness? When have you experienced the unexpected release or cancellation of a debt that was owed? We go to Matthew 18, 28 to 31, and we see the slave and his fellow slave. After this grand gesture of unexpected forgiveness, one might think the forgiven slave would want to express similar generosity and forgiveness in response to others. But in these verses, we get the opposite. We see the one forgiven so much, almost as soon as he leaves the presence of the king who forgave him, he encounters a fellow slave and a co-worker who happens to owe the recently forgiven an amount that is small change in what this guy owed the king. We see no mercy, pity, grace, or forgiveness in this part of the story. The one previously forgiven seeks to resort back to how the world operates. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. When the fellow slave begs for mercy parallel to the earlier scene, it is as if the debt-collecting slave has amnesia. Unfortunately, other slaves or co-workers see the scene knowing both the earlier and current story, and like self-righteous siblings ratting out another sibling to their mom or dad, these slaves run back to the king and tattle on the forgiven slave. This whole little scene is an indictment upon the failure to learn to forgive what is necessary to keep the community whole. The unforgiving slave and those who tattle are still stuck in that retaliatory pattern of the world rather than the kingdom of heaven. So I ask, why is it so hard to break the cycle of wanting to get even and be vindicated? verses 32 to 34, a return visit to a not-so-happy king. The forgiven slave is summoned back to the king after the report of his unforgiving behavior. But this part of the story may raise even more questions, and our understanding of God as portrayed as the king in the story. One question is, would God ever take back forgiveness? It may be that the point of this scene is the priority of showing mercy. But what does it mean for us to be merciful to a fellow church member as God has been merciful to us? How do we do justice and show mercy? The king's action may be understood in the context of a king seeking to maintain his honor and not be played the fool. Some might look at his act of forgiving the slave in the first place as in the beginning as a sign of being soft or weak, presenting an image of the possibility of one to not have to be afraid or fear the consequences of one's own behavior. Some might see Jesus using strong exaggeration in the king's response as a means of stressing how important forgiveness and mercy are in the kingdom of heaven enterprise. I must admit that I am a little uncomfortable with using fear tactics to motivate right behavior. It never worked well when I was parenting my own children, and such tactics normally are only short-term motivators and do not influence long-term behavior change. But this forgiveness business is serious, and it is at the core of the gospel we proclaim. So just maybe Jesus and Matthew share this harsh ending to appeal to the priority that it must play in the Christian community if the community is going to have a viable witness to a world where people think it's about keeping score or just wanting to get what's owed them. Verse 35. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. In verse 21, the beginning of our lesson, Peter wants to know how many times we are to forgive a brother or sister who sins against us. Jesus provides an answer that expresses an unlimited quantity. In closing this lesson, we listen to Jesus provide a word about the quality of our forgiveness from our heart. As parents have often said, say it like you mean it and act like you mean it. As we live in community with others, there will always be the potential that you or I will say or do something that offends another, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This lesson raises the question of when this happens, what will we do about it? Forgiving one another is always the end goal. However, getting there is not always easy or simple. Thankfully, we find the promise and the example in Jesus of our God extending mercy and forgiveness as often as is necessary. God bless you as you prepare for your own worship of God this week. May this little word from Jesus through Matthew 18 be a source of teaching and encouragement.